live sometime soon. Maybe. Okay, yes, we are. I can hear myself well. It's working well. Just share. LinkedIn keeps asking if I want to publish in a group. Was it data scientist analyst? Yeah, whatever post. Could use more subscribers. So we have this EEG. It's the original source. This tool is quite good, but we will be trying to improve on it, or making our own. Anything we can make ourselves, we want to do. Surf it. Let's see. So this is not working at the moment. Back to GPT. So we have a up by. I was need to plot the structure. Could you also plot the structure of the folders and files in it for this project? So
certainly.
yeah, that's
below is a suggested folder and file structure for your flask-based EEG dev visualization project. This organization follows typical Flask project conventions and includes all the elements discussed in this conversation. Here's a brief explanation of each item. app.py. This is your main Flask application file where your server-side code resides. Requirements.txt. This file lists all the Python packages required for your project. readme.md. This markdown file contains documentation for your project, explaining what it does and how to set it up and run it. Static. This folder contains static files like CSS and JavaScript. Your style.css and EEG.js files will be in this folder. Templates. This folder contains HTML templates. The plot HTML file will reside here. Data. This is an optional folder where you can keep any sample data files. It's not strictly necessary but can be useful for testing and development. To create these folders and files, you can use your operating system's file explorer or run appropriate shell commands in your terminal. Then, you can populate these files with the respective code snippets and information provided throughout this conversation.
yeah, let's move that oh, crashed. Visual Studio Code, nice. Yeah, those were large files. Yeah, you don't want that to happen in the beginning of your live stream. Okay, I did move the data across. Obviously this would not work anymore. Don't need to display the text file. I moved the text files into the data folder. Make sure that the JSON file is called correctly. We want to regenerate the HTML.
Great. Moving the text files into a data folder is a good organizational choice. If you're using a JSON file for configuration or other purposes, make sure to adjust the path in your app.py or wherever it's being read. Now, for the updated plot, HTML, let's assume you've included a script tag for the EEG.js file, which should be in your static folder. Here's the complete plot, HTML. The above HTML includes controls for the overlay options and separation value placed above the chart. The chart container where the Plotly chart will be rendered. A script tag linking to the EEG.js file in a static folder. This script handles the client-side logic for adjusting overlay options and separation between channel waveforms. Make sure to run this code locally to see if it meets your requirements. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask.
I have to update a few things first. Code 64 lines, but that's not right. Okay, let's go over the HTML quickly. Drop down. Okay. A plot container. Right. Well, that's correct because we moved we now have a JSON script file as well. So that does mean that the HTML file becomes smaller. We have this let's pop the file structure into here. What else do we have? We have the prompts. Yeah, this is essentially everything we went through in this chat. It's not the actual prompts. We'll generate the prompts in a bit. Probably have to start a new chat for that. HTML script, a JSON file, JSON script in the static folder. It's legit. Now there's JavaScript. So we do need a separate JavaScript. So what's up with, is that a placeholder? Looks like a placeholder to me. Okay, we also have this prompt with requirements, text. Might just have it in the main folder here. I'm not using it because I'm not actually installing it from here. We do need a readme. Where normally a readme file will go to. Just one sec. readme file clone. Okay, this readme file specifically for I don't have it loaded on GitHub yet. But we'll have the file anyway, just because it's a good practice. Running the application. Okay, I have a license file. Okay, what else did we have? Right, that bit. Let's run it quickly, see what we get. Close that window just to be sure. Right, this file should be Panixi G2 data capital D. Right, this 5, refresh this. Separation value, that's still we have the values, and let's check F12 for a sec. Yeah, I want this to be on top somewhere. It's loading for so long, almost 7 seconds. That's crazy. It's taking it from cache. I think it's okay. Yeah, those values are not being so overlay. And change not updating the chat to we need an event for that.
If the overlay options and separation value changes are not updating the chart, it's likely that the JavaScript event listeners are not triggering the updates as expected. Yes, you need to set up events to listen for changes on these controls and then update the Plotly chart accordingly. Here's a modified version of EEG JS that should include event listeners and handle these changes. Make sure that this EEG JS is properly linked in your plot HTML as mentioned in previous examples. Here, the update overlay and update separation functions are said to be called whenever the value of the dropdown or the slider changes, respectively. This is done using the add event listener method on those HTML elements. Please run this updated EEG JS code locally to see if it correctly updates the chart based on changes to the overlay options and separation value controls.
It seemed to be the same as what we had prior. I'm pretty sure we haven't. Where's the network? Yeah, they're not. Place these things on top. JS 27. Something wrong. It's 2 errors. Let's see if we can quickly
The
solve
error suggests
those.
2 issues. Cannot read properties of undefined reading map. This likely means that data is undefined at the time you're trying to map over it in the update separation function. Cannot read properties of undefined reading underscore way editing. This likely means that Plotly's relayout function is not getting what it expects, possibly due to how the layout updates are being done in the update overlay function. To fix these issues, you could add checks to ensure that the variables are defined before attempting to operate on them. Here's an updated EEG.js. In this updated version, I've added checks to ensure that plot div and data are defined before attempting to use them. This should help to prevent the errors you're encountering. Please run this updated code locally to see if it resolves the issues. The _way editing error typically occurs when trying to perform a Plotly relayout operation on a plot that has not been rendered yet or isn't recognized. This can happen for various reasons. The Plotly chart has not been fully rendered when the relayout function is called. The target element specified, plot, in your case, is incorrect or not found. Here are some suggestions to debug the issue. Try wrapping your JavaScript code within a window, onloader document, add event listener, DOM content loaded, function, block to ensure that the DOM is fully loaded before the script runs. Make sure the element ID used in Plotly relayout plot layout update matches the ID of the container where the Plotly graph is rendered. In your case, it should be plot as per your HTML structure. Add some debugging output to check if the variables are defined and to identify which part of the code is throwing the error. For example, by adding these debugging lines, you can get more insight into what might be going wrong. Check the browser's console for output. Please implement these suggestions and run your code locally to see if it helps in resolving the issue. Make sure the element ID used in Plotly relayout plot layout update matches the ID of the container where the Plotly graph is rendered. In your case, it should be plot as per your HTML structure.
Also, this element is not being used at all.
The selected option variable is indeed declared but not used in the example code snippets I provided. Normally, you would use this variable to determine what kind of layout updates to perform based on the selected overlay option. Here's an example of how you might use selected option to change the behavior of your Plotly chart. This is just a simplified example. The actual logic would depend on what you want to happen when different overlay options are selected. In this example, selected option is used to determine which set of layout updates to apply to the Plotly chart. Replace the comments with actual Plotly layout properties as needed for your specific application. Please run this updated code. In this example, selected option is used to determine which set of layout updates to apply to the Plotly chart. Replace the comments with actual Plotly layout properties as needed for your specific application.
This bit we want them to be separated and grouped.
Certainly. The add logic to update layout part would be where you define how the chart should look based on the selected overlay option. For instance, if you have an option to group channels by side, left and right, you may want to change the colors or shapes of the traces to reflect this. If you have an option to overlay all channels, you may want to make the traces semi-transparent so they are all visible. Here's an example to illustrate. In this example, if grouped is selected, the lines for the left side might be colored red and those on the right side blue, with different dash styles. If overlay all is selected, all lines might be made semi-transparent. If the option is off or any other value, all lines are solid black. Replace these layout properties with the actual properties you want to change, as these are just examples to illustrate the point. Please note that the actual syntax for changing these properties might differ depending on how your Plotly chart is structured. The above is a generic representation. Run this updated code locally to see if it meets your requirements.
Why is the generic representation? It feels like we're missing some like some context was lost. Where was it? Can we regenerate? Plot 4 in red and 4 in blue. It should be 8 and 8. And that's not what we want anyway. Okay, let's see. Right, off is the default line color. Is it? We'll plot them all in black, I think.
In this example, if grouped is selected, the lines for the left side might be colored red and those on the right side blue with different dash styles. If overlay all is selected, all lines might be made semi-transparent. If the option is off or any other value, all lines are solid black.
So that's in JavaScript. Regenerate the JavaScript file.
Certainly. Below is the updated EEG JS file with the added logic for updating the layout based on the selected overlay option and for updating the separation between channel waveforms. This EEG JS file includes resize plot to resize the plot when the window is resized. Update overlay to update the layout based on the selected overlay option. It checks the value of the select input and updates the layout accordingly. Update separation to update the separation between the channel waveforms based on the slider's value. Event listeners for window resizing, overlay option changes, and separation value changes. Please run this updated EEG JS code locally to see if it meets your requirements.
But if it works, right? See, the event should be okay. So that works so far. And no, that's still the same problem. And that's not even being taken into account. So what's that for line for the console? Right. It's the same error or different? I'm not sure. Let's pop them both in. See what it says.
The error message suggests that the Plotly relayout function is having issues, possibly because the chart hasn't been fully initialized when you're trying to update its layout, or the target is incorrect. Here are some suggestions to try and fix the issue. Delay initialization. Make sure you attach the event listeners only after the Plotly chart has been fully initialized. This may require you to rearrange your code to ensure that Plotly, new plot or Plotly, React, or whatever function you're using to initially create the chart, has completed before you attach the event listeners. Check element ID. Make sure that the element ID in Plotly, relayout, plot layout update, actually matches the ID of the div where the Plotly graph is initialized. Debugging. If possible, add debug logs to print out the state of the Plotly chart just before you call Plotly, relayout. This might give you more clues on what is going wrong. Here's how you can modify the update overlay function for debugging. Please try these suggestions and run your code locally to see if it helps resolve the issue.
Already there.
The code you posted is the full JavaScript code for controlling the Plotly chart, including resizing the plot, updating the layout based on overlay options, and updating the separation between channel waveforms. However, it seems you're still experiencing the issue with Plotly, relayout throwing an error. Let's try to debug this step by step. Debugging. Add a console.log statement before Plotly, relayout to print out the layout update and ensure that it is getting the correct values. JavaScript copy code console.log, layout update, layout update. Element check. Add a console.log to print the plot div right before calling Plotly, relayout. Initialization. Make sure that this JavaScript file is loaded after the Plotly chart is initialized. If you're using Flask, ensure that the order of scripts in the HTML file is correct, and consider using window, onload or jQuery's $document, ready, to ensure that the script runs after the full page is loaded. Property check. The properties like line, color and line, opacity should be valid Plotly layout options. Ensure that you're using the correct syntax for these. Here's how you could modify the update overlay function. Please update your code with these debugging lines and run it locally to check the console output for any clues. If the Plotly chart is being initialized in another JavaScript file or inline in your HTML, you should ensure that this EEG script is loaded after the Plotly chart has been initialized. This will help avoid issues where the Plotly relayout function tries to modify a chart that hasn't been created yet. Here are two methods to ensure proper script loading. You can wrap your code inside the window onload event to ensure it runs only after all elements on the page are fully loaded, including the Plotly chart. If you're using jQuery, you can use the $document ready function to run code when the DOM is fully loaded. Note, if you use this method, make sure to include the jQuery library before this script in your HTML. Ensure that the scripts are loaded in the correct order in your HTML. If the Plotly chart is initialized in another JavaScript file, make sure that file is loaded before EEG.js. Please implement these suggestions and run the code locally to see if it resolves the issue.
So we might start a new chat. Should we load it? Probably don't need that.
The provided code is a simple HTML template that seems to be designed for a Flask web application. The HTML uses Flask's Jinja 2 template engine to include some dynamic content. Below are some key points about the code. Meta tags. Essential meta tags are included for setting the character set and viewport settings. CSS link. The CSS file, style.css, is linked dynamically using Flask's URL_for function, which will generate the URL for the static file. Plotly JavaScript. A Plotly JavaScript library is linked to allow for creating interactive plots. Controls div. A set of controls for overlay options and a separation value are provided. A dropdown and a range input are available for user interaction. Plot container. A div container is provided to hold the plot. The variable fig_HTML, presumably containing HTML for the plot, is inserted safely into this container. JavaScript link. A JavaScript file, EEG.js, is linked dynamically using Flask's URL_for function. JavaScript async. You can add the async attribute to your JavaScript less than script greater than tags if you want the browser to continue parsing the page while the script is being downloaded. ARIA labels. To make your controls accessible, you could add ARIA, accessible rich internet applications, labels. Validation. If the step value is expected to be within a certain range, you might want to add validation logic either server-side or client-side. Comments. Comments are generally good, but you may want to be more descriptive for complex sections of code. Safe insertion. You use the safe filter for fig_HTML, which is fine as long as you're sure that the content is safe to directly insert into the page, i.e., it won't execute malicious code. Here's a slightly modified version of your code with some of these suggestions. Feel free to adapt these suggestions according to your requirements.
I think any of this will fix my problems, but just have a quick look. That probably not hurt. Then our label couldn't hurt as well. Right, this is
Your Flask application is designed to read EEG data from a text file and then plot it using Plotly. It's well structured and seems like it should meet your basic requirements. Here are some key points. File reading. You're reading EEG data from a .txt file with pandas. You use skip rows and nrows to load only a specific range of the file into memory. This is efficient for large datasets. Data transformation. You offset the channels for better visualization. Plotting. You use Plotly Express to generate the plot, and then use Plotly's I/O module to convert it to HTML. Flask rendering. You then render a Flask template, injecting the Plotly figures HTML. File path. Be cautious with hard-coded file paths, they can make your application less portable or scalable. Error handling. You might want to add some error handling in case the file is not found or if there are issues with the data. Configuration. Consider externalizing the settings like points_per_second, start_time_in_seconds, etc., to make them configurable without changing the code. User input. If you plan to allow users to choose the data range or other parameters, you could implement that as well. Here's a version of your code with some of these suggestions. Feel free to adapt the suggestions to your specific needs.
made enough function out of loading configuration. We're in debug mode still, that's okay. I don't see anything that stands out. It's the JavaScript.
Your JavaScript code is designed to interact with a Plotly chart embedded in a web page. You have functions to resize the plot based on the window size, update the plot based on overlay options, and adjust the separation between channel waveforms. Here's a breakdown. Resize plot. This function resizes the Plotly chart when the window is resized. It's a good practice to make visualizations responsive. Update overlay. This function updates the layout of the Plotly chart based on selected overlay options. You update properties like line color and opacity. Update separation. This function updates the separation between channel waveforms based on the input from a range slider. Event listeners. You've added event listeners for window resize and changes in overlay options and separation values. Error handling. You have error handling in place, which is good. You may consider showing a user-friendly message if something goes wrong. Data validation. When changing plot attributes, ensure that the data and attributes you are working with are valid and defined to prevent unexpected behavior. Constants. If you have properties like line colors or styles that don't change, consider defining them as constants for easier management. Functional decomposition. Your functions are well decomposed, but you might consider breaking down complex tasks even further for readability and maintainability. Comments. Your code is well commented, making it easy to understand the purpose of each function and block of code. Here's a slightly modified version of your code with some of these suggestions. Feel free to adapt these suggestions as per your specific requirements.
Let's quickly go over the just pop in the CSS. Then we pop in the error. Just restart.
Your CSS code is designed to style a web page that contains a Plotly chart. It seems to focus on making the plot and the page responsive and well aligned. Here's a quick rundown of what your styles are doing. Body. Styles applied to the body. Responsiveness. You've already done a good job making the plot responsive, but you could also consider using media queries to make further adjustments for different screen sizes. Box sizing. Adding box sizing, border box, can make it easier to control dimensions when you have padding or borders. Error handling. In your JavaScript, you could consider adding a user-friendly message if the plot fails to load or resize, and style it appropriately in your CSS. Here's a slightly modified version of your CSS code with some of these suggestions. Feel free to adapt the code to better fit your specific needs.
We can close this window unless, yeah, we'll keep it open for a sec. Still. It keeps getting like errors and stuff. I don't know why. So let's pop in this errors.
The error messages indicate that there's an issue with the Plotly relayout function in your update overlay JavaScript function. Specifically, the error, type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading, _way editing, suggests that something within the Plotly relayout function is trying to access an undefined object property. Here are some suggestions to troubleshoot this issue. Make sure that the Plotly chart is fully initialized before you attempt to update its layout. You might want to ensure that your update overlay function is not getting called before the Plotly chart has been completely rendered. It's also possible that the attributes you are trying to update in the layout update object are not valid for the Plotly relayout function. Make sure that the attributes you are setting are supported by Plotly. You can add some debugging output right before the Plotly relayout called to print out the layout update object and verify it contains what you expect. Here's an updated version of your update overlay function with debug output. If the problem persists, you might want to refer to the Plotly documentation or forums for more specific help, as the error seems to originate within the Plotly library. The function update overlay, in both versions essentially does the same thing. It updates the layout of a Plotly chart based on user-selected overlay options. The main differences are debug output. The first version includes a debug output line, console.log, layout update object, layout update, winking face, that logs the layout update object to the console. This can be useful for debugging, especially if you're experiencing issues like you've described. Comments. The first version also contains some additional comments, but these are more of a style choice and do not affect the functionality of the code. So, functionality-wise, both versions are the same. If you don't need the additional debug output, you can use the version without it. The error message and debug output suggest that the layout update object is being populated as expected, but the Plotly relayout function is still encountering an issue. Specifically, the error, type error, cannot read properties of undefined, reading, _way editing, suggests that the Plotly internals are attempting to access an undefined property. Here are some more things you might consider to debug this issue. Make sure your Plotly chart is fully initialized when update overlay is called. You could consider disabling the dropdown until the chart is loaded, or you could use a Plotly event to know when the chart is ready. Sometimes these kinds of errors occur due to version mismatches between the Plotly JavaScript library and the chart data or layout. Make sure you're using a version of Plotly that is compatible with your use case. If you're trying to update the layout for individual traces, you might consider using Plotly update and specifying which traces should be updated. The error message suggests that the issue may be internal to Plotly. You might find it helpful to consult the official Plotly documentation or forums for this specific error. Here's an example of how you could disable the dropdown until Plotly is ready. This is just a simple example and might not cover all edge cases. You would need to adapt it to fit into your specific code structure.
Yeah, there's some sort of version mismatch, as it says. We got 4 minutes to go.
Yes, version mismatches can often lead to unexplained errors or unexpected behavior. Here are a few steps you can take to ensure version compatibility. First, check the version of Plotly you are using in your project. You can usually find this in your HTML file where you import the Plotly library, or in your package, JSON if you are using NPM to manage dependencies. Once you know the version you're using, consult the Plotly documentation to ensure that the features you're using are supported in that version. Some attributes or methods may have been added, changed, or deprecated in newer or older versions. Based on your findings, you might decide to update to a newer version of Plotly or downgrade to an older one that supports the features you need. Make sure to thoroughly test your application after changing versions to catch any new issues that might arise. If you're still encountering issues, try to isolate the problem by creating a minimal example that reproduces the issue. This can often help pinpoint whether the problem is due to a version mismatch, a bug in your code, or a bug in Plotly itself. Always keep an eye on the browser console for any warnings or error messages that might give you clues. Some libraries print version-specific warnings that can be very informative. By taking these steps, you can either rule out or confirm whether a version mismatch is the cause of your issue. If it turns out that the version is not the problem, you'll at least have narrowed down the list of possible causes.
The plot is working okay though. Plotting works okay. Can I just say bye-bye now?
Certainly, regenerating the entire plot when the overlay option is changed is a viable option, especially if the Plotly relayout method is causing issues. You can use the Plotly new plot method to regenerate the plot with the new layout or data options. Here's a simplified example using JavaScript to demonstrate how to regenerate the Plotly plot when the overlay option is changed. This example assumes that you have a function named generatePlotData that returns the data and layout based on the overlay option selected. In this example, whenever the overlay option is changed, the updateOverlay function will be triggered. This function regenerates the entire plot using Plotly new plot with the new data and layout options based on the selected overlay. This approach can be more resource intensive than simply updating the layout, but it's also more robust, particularly if you are encountering issues with Plotly relayout. Certainly. Below is a complete example of what your EEG JS could look like, considering that you want to regenerate the entire plot whenever the